It begins with a groove, a bass line so infectious it makes your hips sway without thinking. A drum beat so precise, so undeniable, it locks you in, a guitar riff so sharp, so soulful, it cuts right through to your core. This is the sound of Motown, the sound of young love, heartbreak, joy, and protest. The sound that defined a generation, broke racial barriers, and conquered the world. From My Girl to I Heard It Through the Grapevine, from Ain't No Mountain High Enough to Please Mr. Postman, these songs are etched into the very DNA of popular music. They were sung by legends: Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, Martha Reeves, and the Vandellas. Their faces are iconic. Their voices are unforgettable. But there's a secret history to that sound. A story of genius, dedication, and profound injustice. Because those legendary voices, those superstar frontmen and women, were not creating that sound alone behind them, day in and day out, in a cramped, windowless basement studio in Detroit, was a group of musicians. A collective of unsung heroes, unparalleled in their skill and their contribution. They played on more #1 hits than the Beatles, Elvis, the Beach Boys, and the Rolling Stones combined. They were the architects of the sound that defined a generation, yet for decades, you likely never heard their names. This is the forgotten story of the Funk Brothers, the heartbeat of Motown, the engine that drove the hit factory. This is a tale of incredible talent, a sense of long-overdue justice, and the enduring power of a groove that changed the world, all while being paid a simple session fee in a Detroit basement known as the Snakepit. To understand the Funk Brothers, we must first understand the extraordinary phenomenon that was Motown Records. And to understand Motown, we must go back to Detroit in the late 1950s. Detroit, at this time, was a city of immense contrasts. It was the undisputed Motor City, the industrial heartland of America, where Ford, GM, and Chrysler churned out millions of cars. It was a city of immense wealth and immense poverty, a place of hard work, grit, and dreams. It was also a city with a vibrant, thriving music scene, particularly in its African-American neighborhoods. Blues, jazz, gospel, and the nascent sounds of rhythm and blues filled the clubs and churches. It was into this fertile ground that Berry Gordy Jr. emerged. Gordy was a man of immense ambition, shrewd business acumen, and an undeniable ear for pop music. Born in 1929, Gordy had a varied early career: a Golden Gloves boxer, an assembly line worker at Ford, a jazz record store owner, and a songwriter for local artists. He understood the economics of mass production from his time in the auto factories. He saw how the assembly line worked, how every component had to be perfect to create a flawless product. He would apply this same philosophy to making hit records. In 1959, with an $800 loan from his family, Berry Gordy founded his own record label. He called it Tamla Records, soon to be incorporated into Motown Record Corporation. His vision was audacious: to create the sound of young America. He wanted to make records that would transcend racial divides, that would be heard and loved by everyone, black and white, north and south. He wanted to take the raw energy of rhythm and blues and polish it, refine it, and make it irresistible to a mainstream pop audience. But to create that sound, he needed two things: incredible talent in front of the microphone and extraordinary talent behind it. Gordy began signing local artists: Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, the Temptations, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Stevie Wonder. He had an uncanny ability to spot charisma and raw vocal talent. He then put them through a rigorous finishing school process. He hired Maxine Powell to teach them etiquette, stage presence, and how to carry themselves with grace and sophistication. Charlie Atkins, a Broadway choreographer, taught them their iconic dance moves. Gordy understood that a hit record wasn't just about the song. It was about the entire package. It was about visual appeal, professionalism, and universal charm. He wanted his artists to be superstars, capable of playing to any audience anywhere. But the true beating heart of Motown, the engine that made all of this possible, was built in a small, unassuming house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard. This house, purchased by Gordy in 1959, would become Hitsville, USA. It was not a grand, purpose-built studio. It was a renovated family home. On the first floor were the offices. On the top floor was Gordy's apartment. And in the basement, in a cramped cinder-block room, was Studio A. This room, affectionately, or perhaps ironically, known as the Snakepit, was where the magic happened. The Snakepit was tiny, barely big enough for a small group of musicians. It was filled with cheap equipment. A 3-track recorder, later upgraded to 8-track. Old microphones. A simple mixing board. It was a far cry from the opulent, cutting-edge studios of New York or Los Angeles. But in this humble space, a group of musicians would forge one of the most distinctive, recognizable, and commercially successful sounds in music history. These musicians were not Gordy's signed artists. They were the session players, the unsung heroes who showed up every day, played on dozens of tracks, and then went home. Their names rarely, if ever, appearing on the record sleeves. Berry Gordy, in his quest for a consistent, identifiable sound, made a radical decision for the time. He would have a dedicated, in-house session band. This was unusual for the era, when most labels used freelance musicians who drifted from studio to studio. Gordy wanted consistency. He wanted his sound. He began to assemble a core group of local Detroit musicians, mostly African American, some white. These were not rock stars. They were jazz cats, blues players, gospel musicians, men who had honed their craft in Detroit's vibrant club scene. They could read charts, but they could also feel a groove. They were masters of improvisation, but also capable of extraordinary discipline. They were seasoned professionals, many of them older than the young stars they were backing. The core members of this group would come to be known, unofficially, as the Funk Brothers. There wasn't a formal band structure. The lineup was fluid, with around 13 core musicians forming the backbone, and others rotating in and out as needed. But a consistent ensemble emerged. At the drums, the undeniable groove masters, Benny Benjamin, the enigmatic, often troubled genius, and later, the rock-steady Uriel Jones on bass, the man who laid down the melodic, irresistible low end on more hits than anyone else. James Jamerson, a genius whose bass lines are still studied and revered today. On guitar, a trio of diverse talents: Robert White, the master of the chicken scratch rhythm guitar, Joe Messina, the versatile jazz and blues player, and Eddie Willis, the smooth, melodic guitarist on keyboards, the soulful, inventive genius of Earl Van Dyke, the band's de facto leader, along with Johnny Griffith and Richard Pistol Allen, who also played drums. And on percussion, the steady hand of Jack Ashford, adding shakers, tambourines, and other flourishes that became essential to the Motown sound. These men were not stars. They were craftsmen. They were blue-collar musicians in a blue-collar city, punching the clock, day in and day out, in the Snakepit. They were there to create hits, and they would do so with a consistency and a genius that remains unmatched in music history. That house on West Grand Boulevard, Hitsville, USA, was not just an office. It was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week music factory. Berry Gordy, in his quest for hits, had created a system of relentless, round-the-clock production. And the heart of that system, the engine room, was Studio A, the Snakepit. It was called the Snakepit for a reason. It was a small, cramped, low-ceilinged basement room, converted from a garage. The acoustics were, by all technical standards, terrible. The walls were unadorned, the floor was simple tile. Musicians were crammed in, elbow to elbow, baffles and cables snaking around them. The control room was a tiny booth on the other side of a plate glass window, itself a converted dining room. It was hot in the summer, cold in the winter. And yet, this unglamorous, subterranean space would become one of the most magical and prolific recording studios in human history. The process was relentless. The Funk Brothers were not pampered artists. They were, in the truest sense, blue-collar workers. They'd show up around 10 a.m., often staying until well after midnight, or even all night, punching a clock, just like the auto workers down the street. They'd find a simple chord chart, often with no melody written, just the changes a producer, like Smokey Robinson or the team of Holland Dozier Holland, would come in, hum a tune, and give them a basic direction. And then, the magic would begin. This was not a paint-by-numbers operation. Gordy's assembly line analogy was about the process, but the creation was pure improvisational art. The Funk Brothers were given the skeleton, but they were the ones who put the flesh on the bones. This is where their unique backgrounds became Motown's secret weapon. These were not rock and roll kids. These were seasoned, world-class jazz musicians who were playing pop music to pay the bills. They brought a level of sophistication, harmony, and rhythmic complexity to these simple pop songs that no one else in the world was doing. At the center of it all, the unofficial band leader was the pianist, Earl Van Dyke. He was the anchor. His driving, percussive piano style, rooted in bop and R&B, was the glue that held the tracks together. He would often create the signature riffs that the whole song would be built around. Then there was the rhythm section, a holy trinity of groove. On drums, you had two masters. First, Benny Benjamin, known as Papa Zita. Benjamin was the original, the man who defined the Motown beat. He had a jazz background, and he played with an aggressive, slightly behind-the-beat feel that gave the songs an incredible sense of tension and release. He was also a notoriously fiery and unpredictable character, but his talent was undeniable. When Benjamin's personal struggles began to interfere, his protege, Uriel Jones, stepped in, bringing a harder, more driving, rock-inflected backbeat that was perfect for the label's later, tougher sound on songs like I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Sometimes they would even use two drummers on one track, creating a massive, complex wall of rhythm. And then there was James Jamerson. It is impossible to overstate the importance of James Jamerson. He was, quite simply, a genius. A quiet, unassuming man, he would often sit on a stool in the corner of the Snakepit, playing a 1962 Fender Precision bass he'd nicknamed the Funk Machine. Jamerson revolutionized the instrument. In an era when most bass players just played simple, thudding root notes on the beat, Jamerson played melodies. With a single finger, his right index finger he called the hook, he would unleash a torrent of complex, syncopated melodic lines. His bass parts were a song within the song. He would weave in and out of the vocal, play counter melodies, use complex jazz harmonies and chromatic runs, all while never, ever losing the fundamental groove. He was playing lines that other bass players of the era couldn't even comprehend, let alone attempt. Listen to the opening of the Four Tops, Bernadette. The bass doesn't just start, it explodes out of the gate. A frantic, high-register run that sets the song's desperate tone. Listen to My Girl. That simple, ascending, heartbeat-like intro? That's Jamerson, creating one of the most famous bass lines in history, a hook as memorable as the vocal. He was the secret weapon. He was the soul of the Motown Sound. He was, as one of his fellow musicians said, the man who put the funk in the Funk Brothers. But it didn't stop there. You had the three-headed guitar monster. Robert White, with his light, chicken-scratch style on his Gibson guitar, gave songs like My Girl their delicate, distinctive opening riff. Joe Messina, a brilliant jazz player, would add clean, arpeggiated chords, bringing a level of harmonic sophistication from his bebop background. And Eddie Willis, the blues man, would lay down the gritty, soulful rhythm tracks that gave the songs their toughness. Often, all three would be playing at once, their parts woven together so tightly, like a perfect textile, that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And on top of it all was Jack Ashford, the percussionist. He was the man with the tambourine, the shakers, the vibraphone. Ashford added the sparkle, the high-end sheen that made the Motown sound jump out of car radios, that driving tambourine on Dancing in the Street, or the unforgettable vibraphone intro to My Guy. That was Jack Ashford, adding the final, essential layer of polish. This was the team. They would get a chord chart, and then they would jam it. They would work it out, live on the floor of the Snakepit. Earl Van Dyke would call out a change. James Jamerson would find a melodic hook. Benny Benjamin would lock in the beat. They would play for hours, honing a 3-minute pop song with the same intensity and musicianship they would bring to a John Coltrane tune in a jazz club. This was a competitive, creatively charged environment. The producers would hand out the same song to different producers, who would record different versions with the same band. Often on the same day, the Funk Brothers would be in the Snakepit, and Holland Dozier Holland would come in and run them through a track. An hour later, Smokey Robinson would come in with a different arrangement for the same song. And then Norman Whitfield would come in with his version. The musicians, paid by the session, would simply adapt, bringing their A-game to every single take. This internal competition, this survival of the fittest production style, is what made the music so strong. Only the absolute best, most undeniable version of a song would make it through Berry Gordy's quality control meeting. The Funk Brothers were the constant. They were the engine that could adapt to any producer's vision and make it sound, without fail, like a hit. And they were paid a simple session fee. They were not artists in the Motown hierarchy. They were not royalties. They were not getting their names on the records. They were, in the eyes of the system, laborers. Highly skilled laborers, yes, but laborers nonetheless. They were paid a standard union wage for a 3-hour session. They would cut 2, 3, sometimes 4 songs in that single session. They would walk out of the Snakepit at 3 a.m., having just laid down the instrumental track for I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and walk away with their $10 or $15 per song. This anonymity was, for a time, a source of pride. They were the secret weapon. They were the best musicians in town, and they knew it. They had a swagger. They were the kings of the Detroit underworld of music. They would finish a session, go play a jazz gig at a local club until 4 a.m., get a few hours of sleep, and be right back in the Snakepit at 10 a.m. to do it all over again. They were living, breathing, and eating music, But as the 1960s wore on, and the stars they were backing, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, became international superstars, living in mansions and flying in private jets, the anonymity began to chafe. The Funk Brothers were still in Detroit, still in that basement, still getting paid by the hour, all while the entire world was dancing to their beat. They were the invisible men, the ghosts in the machine that was Hitsville. This disconnect between their contribution and their recognition would become a quiet, simmering tragedy that lay at the heart of the Motown story. The sound the Funk Brothers created in that basement was not just a collection of notes. It was an entire musical language. It was the sound of a generation, and it was built piece by piece through a combination of raw talent, unique studio conditions, and groundbreaking, often accidental, innovation. The turning point was not a single day, but a gradual process of discovery, a period between roughly 1964 and 1967 where the formula was perfected. This was when the raw R&B of early tracks like Money, That's What I Want, evolved into the sophisticated, complex pop soul of My Girl or Reach Out, I'll Be There. This evolution was driven entirely by the musicians in the Snakepit. Let's dissect this sound. The foundation, as with any great band, was the rhythm. Motown records move. They are built for dancing, for driving in a car. This was no accident. The Funk Brothers, led by Benny Benjamin and later Uriel Jones, didn't just play a simple 4/4 rock beat. They infused it with the polyrhythms of jazz and the ecstatic release of gospel. A signature Motown trick was the relentless tambourine, played by Jack Ashford, hitting every single beat, 1, 2, 3, 4. This wasn't a subtle color. It was a driving, percussive engine, a high-frequency sound that cut through the AM radio static and made the song literally jump out of the speaker. It was a sound designed for the tiny, tinny speakers of a generation on the move. On top of this, you had the snare drum, often accented heavily on every beat, creating an almost military, marching feel. Listen to Dancing in the Street. It's not a suggestion. It's a command, a call to action, driven by that powerful, relentless snare. This percussive density made the music feel urgent, joyous, and impossible to ignore. But the true revolution was happening in the low end. In the mid-1960s, bass guitar was almost an afterthought in pop music. It was a rhythm instrument, meant to be felt but not necessarily heard. Often just thudding along on the root notes, James Jamerson changed that forever. He single-handedly invented the concept of the lead bass player. Jamerson, a jazz musician at heart, was famously restless. He refused to play the same bass line twice. He saw the space between the kick drum and the vocal as his own personal canvas. He would arrive at the studio, often after playing a long jazz gig, set up his Fender Precision bass, with its strings famously never changed, caked in sweat and grime, which he believed gave it a funky sound, and plug directly into the studio's custom-built recording console. He used only one finger, the hook, to pluck the strings, giving him a massive, powerful, and consistent tone that was all his own. What he played was extraordinary. His bass lines were complex, melodic, and highly syncopated. He would walk all over the chord changes, using jazz-inspired chromatic runs and ghost notes that added a layer of incredible sophistication. Listen to My Girl by The Temptations. The song opens with that simple six-note guitar riff from Robert White. Then, on the third beat, the bass enters. But Jamerson doesn't just play the root note, he plays a counter melody. He plays an ascending, heartbeat-like phrase that becomes the song's main hook, arguably more famous than the vocal line itself. Or listen to the Four Tops' "Reach Out, I'll Be There." The song is a blast of dramatic, almost operatic pop. But beneath Levi Stubbs's passionate vocal, Jamerson's bass is in constant, frantic motion, playing a running 16th note pattern that sounds like a man chasing after his departing lover. It's not just rhythm, it's storytelling. He was, in effect, a second lead vocalist. This melodic, dominant bass sound became the absolute, non-negotiable signature of the Motown Sound. It was the funk in the Funk Brothers. Then, there were the guitars. Motown didn't just use one guitar. They used a guitar army. Robert White, Joe Messina, and Eddie Willis would all be playing at the same time. Their parts interlocking like a perfectly machined puzzle. Robert White would often play the high, tinny, chicken scratch rhythm, a percussive sound that just added to the groove. Joe Messina, the jazz veteran, would play clean, complex chords higher up the neck, adding harmonic color, and Eddie Willis would hold down the low-end, gritty blues riffs. A classic example? "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," that bright, driving, repetitive guitar chord that opens the track. That's one of the guitarists playing a simple, clean part. "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," that swampy, ominous, tremolo-soaked riff that sets the entire paranoid mood. That was born in the Snakepit. By having three guitarists, each playing a small, specific part, the producers could create one massive, complex guitar sound that was impossible for any single musician to replicate. The final piece of the sonic puzzle was the studio itself. The Snakepit was, by professional standards, a terrible recording room, but its flaws became its greatest strengths. It was a small, concrete-walled basement. The sound had nowhere to go. It was boxy, live, and immediate. There was no natural, lush reverb like you'd find in a big Hollywood studio. This created a dry, punchy, in-your-face sound. To make matters worse, or in this case, better, the studio was so small that the sound from one instrument would bleed into the microphone of another. The drums would bleed into the piano mic. The bass would bleed into the drum mics. In any other studio, this would be a catastrophic engineering error. At Motown, it was the secret ingredient. This microphone bleed meant that the instruments weren't just being recorded separately. They were being recorded together, in the same acoustic space. They were, in a very real sense, being pre-mixed live in the room. This created a glue that locked the band together. The sounds fused, creating a single, massive, mono-compatible punch. It's why a Motown record doesn't sound like a collection of separate instruments. It sounds like one instrument, one massive groove machine. The engineers, led by men like Mike McLean, further enhanced this. They would often record the instruments hot, pushing the levels on the tape machine to the point of slight distortion. This saturation, this tape compression, made the drums punch harder and the bass sound rounder and warmer. It was a gritty, powerful, and utterly unique sound, born from a combination of cheap equipment, a bad room, and brilliant musicians. This was the machine. This was the assembly line in action. A songwriter like Smokey Robinson would bring in a masterpiece like "The Tracks of My Tears." He'd have the lyrics, the melody, the basic chords. He'd bring it to the Funk Brothers. James Jamerson would find that iconic descending bass line. Marv Tarplin, Smokey's personal guitarist, would lay down the delicate intro. The band would find the groove, and in 3 hours, they would have created one of the most perfect, heartbreaking, and sophisticated songs in pop history, all for a flat union wage. Then, they'd break for a soda and do it again. This was the turning point. The Funk Brothers had not just found a sound, they had perfected a process. They were the Hit Factory's engine, a group of anonymous, brilliant musicians who could take any raw material, a ballad, a dance tune, a novelty song, and turn it, without fail, into a solid gold Motown hit. They had forged the sound of young America, and as the 1960s reached their peak, the stars they backed, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, became household names, their faces on televisions and magazine covers around the world. The Funk Brothers, meanwhile, remained in the basement. The sound that the Funk Brothers had perfected was, by 1967, the dominant sound of pop radio. It was a flawless machine. But the world outside the Snakepit's walls was beginning to crack. The long, hot summer of 1967 saw racial tensions explode across America. And in July, the conflict came home. The Detroit riot was not a distant news story. It was a war zone. Tanks rolled down West Grand Boulevard, just blocks from Hitsville. The city was on fire. This event, combined with the escalating Vietnam War and the rise of a more militant, politically aware Black Power movement, changed the very air that people breathed. The sound of young America, with its innocent tales of young love, suddenly felt inadequate. The world had become a much more complicated, angry, and psychedelic place. This cultural shift forced a change inside Motown. A new generation of producers, led by the brilliant and ambitious Norman Whitfield, began to challenge the Holland-Dozier-Holland formula. Whitfield, sensing the changing tides, wanted to create something grittier, something that reflected the paranoia and social commentary of the era. He began to listen to the psychedelic rock of Sly and the Family Stone and Jimi Hendrix. This led to the birth of psychedelic soul. And the Funk Brothers, the ultimate musical chameleons, were asked to adapt once again. They were told to grow their hair, to buy wah-wah pedals and fuzz boxes. The simple 3-minute pop song was replaced by sprawling 7, 8, or even 12-minute cinematic epics. Listen to Cloud 9 by The Temptations from 1968. That's not the old Motown. The track opens with a disorienting, panning conga beat, a nervous bass line, and a biting, fuzzed-out guitar riff. This was the Funk Brothers, specifically guitarist Dennis Coffey, introducing rock and roll's psychedelic vocabulary into the Snakepit. This new sound reached its peak with songs like Ball of Confusion, That's What the World Is Today, and War. These were not love songs. These were angry, rapid-fire, thunderous indictments of the state of the world. War, first recorded by The Temptations, then a massive hit for Edwin Starr, was a raw, primal scream. The Funk Brothers, who could play the sweetest melodies, now proved they could play with terrifying, heavy power. And then, there was Marvin Gaye's 1971 masterpiece, What's Going On? This album was, in many ways, the artistic peak for the Funk Brothers. For the first time, an artist, Marvin Gaye, was giving them the freedom to be the jazz musicians they were. The entire album was recorded in a loose jam session atmosphere, and at the center of it all, once again, was James Jamerson. The legendary story is that Jamerson was called in to play on the title track. He had been out playing in a club all night and was, by all accounts, inebriated. He lay flat on his back on the studio floor and played the entire intricate melodic bass line in a single perfect take. It wasn't just a bass line. It was a counter-vocal, an answer to Marvin's plea, a work of pure, unadulterated genius. The What's Going On album was the Funk Brothers unleashed, their most sophisticated, soulful, and complex work. This period, from 1968 to 1972, proved their boundless versatility. They had gone from doo-wop to pop to soul to psychedelia to sophisticated jazz funk, all without missing a beat. They had defined the sound of an entire decade. But the personal toll was mounting. The anonymity, which had once been a source of insider pride, was beginning to curdle into resentment. The relentless, high-pressure, 24/7 work schedule was grinding them down. They were musicians, not machines, and the assembly line was taking its toll. They would be in the Snakepit, creating the foundation for a song that would sell 5 million copies. They would pour their genius, their hooks, and their very souls into the tape. And at the end of the session, they would collect their $10 union scale payment and go home. Then, months later, they would turn on the television and see the star, be it Diana Ross or Michael Jackson, in a limousine, wearing furs, being hailed by the world for the Motown Sound. Their sound. This disconnect was becoming impossible to ignore. They were invisible men. They couldn't even tell their families what songs they had played on, because the sessions were so fast and so numerous. They often didn't know which track was which, until they heard it on the radio months later. Jack Ashford recalled hearing a song in his car, recognizing his own tambourine playing, and thinking, "Wow, that's a hit. I wonder who the artist is." This pressure and lack of recognition had its most tragic consequences for the band's greatest genius, James Jamerson. Jamerson, a quiet and sensitive man, was battling severe alcoholism he felt underappreciated, unacknowledged. He was creating the most influential bass lines in pop history, and his name was nowhere. As his struggles deepened, he became less reliable, sometimes showing up to sessions too drunk to play. Motown, in its relentless, unsentimental fashion, began to replace him with other, younger bass players, like Bob Babbitt, who could ably mimic his style. The engine was beginning to show cracks, but the final, fatal blow was not creative or personal. It was corporate. Berry Gordy was a businessman, first and last. He had conquered Detroit. He had conquered America. Now he wanted to conquer the world, and the next logical frontier was Hollywood. He had already had massive success with the Jackson 5 and the Supremes, and he had his sights set on the movie business. He produced the 1972 Billie Holiday biopic, Lady Sings the Blues, starring Diana Ross. It was a massive critical and commercial success, earning 5 Academy Award nominations. For Gordy, the writing was on the wall. The future was not in a cramped basement in Detroit. It was in Los Angeles, the land of film, television, and year-round sunshine. The Motown Sound, he felt, could be replicated. The Funk Brothers, in his mind, were replaceable parts on his assembly line. In 1972, Berry Gordy made the move. He secretly and swiftly relocated the entire Motown operation from Detroit to Los Angeles. This was the escalation. This was the avalanche. This was the betrayal that finally broke the band. Gordy didn't hold a meeting. He didn't send a memo. He didn't thank the musicians who had built his empire. He just left. The story, as told by the surviving Funk Brothers, is heartbreaking. One by one, the musicians, the men who had worked in that studio every day for over a decade, showed up for their 10 a.m. session. They walked up to the house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard, the place they had called home, and they found the doors chained shut. Tacked to the front door was a cold, simple note, like something from a jilted lover. It read, "Motown Records. Moved to Los Angeles." That was it. After a decade of loyalty, after creating more hits than the Beatles, Elvis, and the Rolling Stones combined, their service was terminated by a note on a door. It was a devastating, final blow. the Funk Brothers were left behind. Gordy and his new Los Angeles headquarters simply hired new, cheaper, often non-union session players, and the sound was never, ever the same. The Motown magic, that perfect, inimitable groove forged in the Snakepit, was a product of a specific time, a specific place, and a specific group of musicians. It was a chemistry that could not be replicated. When Motown left Detroit, it left its heart behind. The Funk Brothers were scattered. They were suddenly, shockingly unemployed. They were the best musicians in the world, but they were now in their 40s and 50s, and the music industry had moved on. They were session musicians, and the sessions had dried up. The hit factory had shut down, and they were left standing outside the locked gates. The greatest band in American history had been broken up, not by creative differences, but by a corporate memo. The note on the door at 2648 West Grand Boulevard was more than just a corporate memo. It was an ending. It was the moment the greatest hit-making machine in history was unplugged, and the engine room was simply abandoned. What followed for the Funk Brothers was not a new chapter, but a long, slow, and agonizing fade into obscurity. This was the true avalanche, not an avalanche of sound, but an avalanche of silence. These men, who had been the secret kings of a musical empire, were now just musicians in a city whose primary industry had just packed up and left. They scattered. Some, like guitarist Eddie Willis, tried to follow Motown to Los Angeles, but the scene was different. The LA studios had their own clique of session players, the Wrecking Crew, and there was little room for the veterans from Detroit. Others, like percussionist Jack Ashford, found some success in the burgeoning disco scene, but the magic of the collective was gone. Most of them simply stayed in Detroit, a city that was itself struggling, trying to find work wherever they could. They went back to the jazz clubs, they played on local commercial jingles, they taught lessons. They were masters of a craft for which there was suddenly no market. The psychological toll was immense. They had been the anonymous engine of the sound of young America. But now, that anonymity, once a quirky part of the job, became a curse. How do you prove your greatness when your name is on nothing? How do you audition for a new gig by saying, "You know that bass line on My Girl? That was me," when the record sleeve credits The Temptations? No one suffered this fate more tragically or more profoundly than the group's singular genius, James Jamerson. Jamerson was, without argument, the most influential electric bass player of the 20th century. He had invented a new language for the instrument, a melodic, syncopated style that would influence generations of bassists, from Paul McCartney, who openly admitted to studying his lines, to modern players today. He was, in a very real sense, the Bach of the bass guitar. When Motown left for LA, Jamerson was adrift. His drinking, which had been a problem for years, now consumed him. He did move to Los Angeles, hoping to find session work, but the musical landscape had changed. The sound of the late 70s was disco, with its clean, simple, metronomic bass lines. Producers didn't want a busy player like Jamerson. With his complex, jazzy runs, they wanted simple, on-the-beat thumping. He was a virtuoso in a world that now demanded simplicity. He became a ghost in the studios he had once ruled. He was broke, often borrowing money from other musicians. He was seen, in his final years, sitting on a bench on Hollywood Boulevard, unrecognized, clutching his funk machine bass, a king in exile. James Jamerson died in 1983 from complications of cirrhosis of the liver and heart failure. He was only 47 years old. He died in obscurity, his name unknown to the millions who were at that very moment dancing to his bass lines at weddings, in commercials, and on the radio. His death was the ultimate tragic symbol of the Funk Brothers' fate, to have created the sound of joy for the entire world, while dying alone and forgotten. The other members fared better, but they too lived in this strange twilight. Benny Benjamin, the original drummer, had already passed away in 1969. His body worn out by his own demons, Earl Van Dyke continued to lead bands in Detroit. A local legend, but a global unknown. They watched as the music they had created became a timeless soundtrack, used in movies, in ads, generating billions of dollars, and they saw none of it. They were living footnotes to their own life's work. For decades, this was where the story ended. A quiet, Detroit-based tragedy. The hits played on, but the names of the men who played them were lost to time. But then, the verdict of history began to shift. The first confession came not from an executive, but from a fellow musician. In 1983, a Scottish musician and author named Alan Slutsky, a bass player himself, set out on a quest. He had spent his life, like so many other bassists, trying to learn Jamerson's impossible lines, and he wanted to know who this mystery man was. He began a long, journalistic investigation, interviewing the surviving Funk Brothers, digging through old studio logs, and piecing together the story. In 1989, his work culminated in the book Standing in the Shadows of Motown, the life and music of legendary bassist James Jamerson. This book was more than a music biography. It was a revelation. For the first time, it meticulously transcribed Jamerson's playing, note for note, and it told his tragic story. It gave a name, a face, and a history to the man behind the groove. For the music community, it was a seismic event. It was the first time the veil had truly been lifted. The book was a critical success and sparked a new wave of interest. It was the turning point. It had taken almost 20 years, but the names, James Jamerson, Benny Benjamin, Earl Van Dyke, Robert White, were finally beginning to be spoken aloud. This spark ignited a full-blown fire in the early 2000s. A filmmaker named Paul Justman, inspired by Slutsky's book, decided to take the story to the next level. He wanted to make a documentary. But his idea was not just to tell the story, he wanted to show it. He would find the surviving Funk Brothers, bring them back together, and have them play the music they had created. The resulting 2002 film, also titled Standing in the Shadows of Motown, was the ultimate verdict. It was the confession the world had been waiting for. The film opens with a challenge. The narrator asks you to name the band that played on all these massive hits, more than the Beatles, Beach Boys, and Elvis. And then he introduces you, one by one, to the forgotten men. We see them now in their 60s and 70s. We see Jack Ashford, the tambourine man, still sharp and full of stories. We see Uriel Jones and Richard Pistol Allen, the drummers still holding down the beat. We see guitarist Eddie Willis and bassist Bob Babbitt, who had often filled in for Jamerson in the later years. We see them walk back into the Snakepit, now a dusty, preserved museum. We watch them as they look at the old, worn-out instruments, their eyes filling with tears as they remember their fallen comrades, Jamerson, Benjamin, White, Van Dyke. And then the most powerful thing happens. They pick up their instruments, and the second they start to play, the years melt away. That sound, that magic, is instantly there. The film shows them, these humble, elderly men, playing the backing tracks to Ain't No Mountain High Enough, or I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and it is a resurrection. The film's climax is a concert where the surviving Funk Brothers are backed by modern artists like Joan Osborne, Ben Harper, and Bootsy Collins, We watch Joan Osborne, guided by the band, attempt to sing "What's Going On." And we see the Funk Brothers, no longer in the shadow, but in the spotlight, receiving a thunderous, standing ovation, their names finally being chanted by a crowd. The film was a massive critical and commercial success. It won multiple awards, including a Grammy for its soundtrack. And in one powerful 90-minute sweep, it corrected 30 years of history. This was the avalanche of truth. The impact was immediate. In 2004, the Funk Brothers were awarded a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Their names were finally being etched into the history books. They were no longer session musicians. They were the Funk Brothers. The release of Standing in the Shadows of Motown was more than a film. It was a cultural reckoning. It was the moment that history, which is so often written by the victors and the famous, was paused, rewound, and corrected. The verdict was in, delivered not just by critics, but by the public, who were introduced to these incredible men for the first time, the greatest, most successful, and most heard band in American history, finally had a name: the Funk Brothers. Their legacy is, in a word, unquantifiable. How do you measure the impact of the bass line that was playing on the radio when a soldier in Vietnam got a letter from home? How do you quantify the groove that was the soundtrack to the civil rights movement? The backbeat to marches, to sit-ins, to a generation demanding change. How do you put a number on the songs that have been the first dance at 1,000,000 weddings, the comfort for 1,000,000 heartbreaks, the pure joy at 1,000,000 backyard barbecues? The Funk Brothers didn't just play on pop hits. They created the sonic wallpaper of the 20th century. They were the anonymous authors of a universal language. Their music, born in a cramped, sweaty basement, transcended its origins and became the sound of young America. A sound that broke racial barriers with a simple, undeniable 4/4 beat. Before Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream that was televised, Berry Gordy had a dream that was broadcast. To get white kids and black kids dancing to the same song. It was the Funk Brothers who provided that beat. They were, in the most literal sense, agents of social change, one 3-minute single at a time. For decades, their anonymity was the key to Motown's success. The Motown brand was built on the artist, the star. It was Diana Ross. It was Smokey Robinson. It was Stevie Wonder. It was the Temptations. This was the genius of Berry Gordy's assembly line. The product was interchangeable, but the brand, Motown, was consistent. The Funk Brothers were, in his eyes, the most important part of the machinery, but they were still, ultimately, machinery. They were the engine, but the public was only supposed to see the shiny, polished car. The great irony, of course, is that Gordy's move to Los Angeles in 1972 proved the opposite. He moved the factory, but he left the engine behind and the Motown sound, that specific, magical, gritty, and sophisticated punch, never truly made the trip. The LA sessions produced hits, yes, but the sound was different. It was cleaner, more polished, more Hollywood. It had lost the sound of the Snakepit. It had lost the sound of Detroit. It had lost the specific, irreplaceable chemistry of those 13 men Gordy had, in his quest for a bigger empire, dismantled the very thing that made his empire unique. He proved by their absence that the Funk Brothers were not replaceable cogs in a machine. They were the machine. This long-overdue recognition, however, is a profoundly bittersweet victory. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2004 was a joyous occasion. It was a moment of vindication. But it was a standing ovation that many of the band's core members never lived to hear. Benny Benjamin, the original drummer, the man who set the template for the Motown beat, died in 1969, just as the sound he helped create was at its absolute peak, and long before his name was ever spoken outside of Detroit. And then, most tragically, there is James Jamerson, the man whose influence is on par with that of Louis Armstrong or Jimi Hendrix in terms of changing how an instrument is played. He died in 1983, broke and obscure. He was buried in an unmarked grave. It was only years later, after the release of Slutsky's book, that a collection of fans and fellow musicians, including people like Paul McCartney, raised the money to buy him a proper headstone. That headstone now reads, James Jamerson, a beloved husband and father, the creator of the Motown Sound, the funk machine. May his music live forever. His story is the story of the Funk Brothers in miniature, transcendent genius, heartbreaking anonymity, and a recognition that came, for him, far too late. But the legacy is not just in the awards or the belated recognition. The true legacy of the Funk Brothers is in the music itself, and in the musicians who came after them. Every time a bass player plays a melodic run instead of just the root notes, they are standing in the shadow of James Jamerson. Every time a producer layers a tambourine on top of a snare drum to make a track pop, they are borrowing a trick from Jack Ashford. Every time a guitarist plays a clean, funky chicken scratch riff, they are speaking the language of Robert White. The Funk Brothers didn't just create a string of hits, they created a blueprint. They wrote the textbook for pop soul production. Their innovations, born from a mix of jazz genius and pop simplicity in a bad-sounding room, became the industry standard. The final verdict, then, is this. The Funk Brothers were the most successful, most influential, and least known band in American history. They were the victims of a brilliant, ruthless system that demanded their genius, but denied them their names. For decades, they were the ghosts in the machine. But today, the story has changed. Thanks to the work of historians and to the surviving members who refused to let their story die, the veil has been lifted. We can now hear My Girl and know that's Robert White's riff and James Jamerson's bass. We can hear I Heard It Through the Grapevine and know that's the dark, primal groove of Uriel Jones and Eddie Willis. The house on West Grand Boulevard is no longer a factory. It is a museum. And the Snakepit, that cramped, holy basement, is preserved, a monument to the men who toiled there in obscurity. They were not just session players. They were not just an engine. They were artists. They were the men who took a small, $800 loan and turned it into the sound that defined a century. They were and are forever the Funk Brothers. If you enjoy these deep dives into the secret histories of music, the stories of the unsung heroes who created the soundtracks of our lives, then this is what we do here. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue to unpack the legends.